Well, I'm not going to do what Matt did and ask you the question, how many supply chain people are in the room? But I will ask you, how many have stayed home for a delivery and been disappointed? How many people have had that experience? So I'm working with people who felt the pain of supply chain not working. And so let me talk to you today about supply chain, integrated business planning. We're going to look at some industry challenges. Some of those have already been expressed so far, but we're all dealing with variability of demand, variability of supply, variability of quality, and variability of lead time, but also uncertainty. A number of supply chain leaders have said to me, Dave, revenue's picking up nicely, but profitability isn't. And I said, why is that then? They said, well, typically it's because of uncertainty and variability, normally manifest in inventory. Leslie's going to come up and tell us how to deliver that from a best practice point of view from Oliver Wight, our partner in this space. And then we're going to give a touch point of Lamb Weston. And I teach on some of this stuff, so I hope you don't mind, but I want to give you a little bit of homework. Okay, I was just waiting for the oh no's. But I think if we don't come to an event like this and don't get some key takeaways, then we've missed an opportunity. So let me kick off with some of the trends that we've been facing, some of the things the impact on business has been truly significant, both post-COVID, but then also triggered events. I don't know whether you remember, it certainly happened in the UK, we were running out of CO2. We were running out of CO2 because the cost of heat to create fertilizer meant that CO2 was not being created. That resulted in a shortage of capability to stun animals to then process the meat. That created massive supply chain disruption. And these are triggered events that are triggered by unexpected other events. My father-in-law was a boxer. I'm not a boxer. I haven't got a broken nose. But he said to me, Dave, one of the ways of beating your opponent is once they've lost their balance, hit them again, and then hit them again, and then hit them again. Now, I'm not suggesting you punch your customers or your suppliers. You might feel like it sometimes, but the reality is this. We have gone through disturbance after disturbance after disturbance. We're off balance as a supply chain, and as a consequence, we never recover. And so some of those protections, some of those buffers we put in place of inventory, of capacity, of supplier contracts, has resulted in us being able never to recover. And when we look forward, the expectation from the marketplace, from our customers, and with our competition, is that we stay that flexible. So we have to start building into our supply chain structural flexibility, the ability to respond, both in terms of capacity and capability. And part of the reason we can't do that is because there are often black holes in our data. We know that a product's being shipped from the Far East. We know it's going to take, or used to take 10 weeks. Now it might be anywhere between 9 and 13. But the reality is we don't have the detail of what's on which particular ship. Do you remember that ship that got stuck, the Evergreen? Got stuck in the canal, and people were saying, okay, what's on it? Which of our products, which of our customers are going to be affected? That's where you needed the data to be able to then put back into your plan and say, how are we going to reconfigure our plan to ensure that our factories keep running, our customers keep happy, and we're able to respond in an intelligent way to drive the plan that drives true profitability for the business. Looking forward, there's quite a challenge around uncertain capacity. People are starting to not just offshore for cheapest source, but looking to right shore and get a balance between cheaper source and greater flexibility more locally at home. You find that even with the Biden bill around silicon chips, thinking about trying to bring onshore capability to silicon chips on the mainland in the US. Well, that means you've got to move your supply from A to B, and that takes planning. With the range of products that you're pulling in, you've got to work on that kind of capability. And then internally, we find that actually as we're restructuring, reconfiguring our supply chains, thinking about maybe moving warehouses, partnering, we found people I find people who are moving from CapEx to OpEx decisions. So instead of building a warehouse, they're hiring a warehouse. It's an easier decision. It's an easier thing to get through the system. I see one or two people nodding there. I'm sure you've done it. But these are the kind of things that supply chain is wrestling with. And these kind of things are driving different planning behaviors. Gartner has expressed this in various different ways. I won't go through the percentages, but actually people are wanting to operate a new business model. The Rubik's Cube of being able to make planning decisions through COVID and into the current climate that we're in means that people want to be able to twist their data and make their data into a new decision. Let's just take, for example, sourcing capacity. You want to check that you've got a plan that is truly feasible. Do you have the capacity to do that? Well, suddenly, as somebody said to me, Dave, we want to stop all our first-tier suppliers and second-tier suppliers who are sourcing from Russia right now. I said, okay, how do you identify them in your sourcing database? They said, we've got to go to a manual spreadsheet. I went, what? But those kind of decisions are the kind of decisions that supply chain planning managers are having to make and want to drive towards more resilient and more agile decisions. And those resilient, agile decisions require that you've got the data there. We've got petabytes of data. That's not the problem. The problem is the concurrency of that data, synchronizing that data, pulling that data together in ways that is meaningful and helps you to drive the right decision in the right time at the right moment. People want to enlarge their capacity to be able to make better decisions. Gigaset, a customer of Board, started to look down their supply chain. They were using the Board platform to help them to make better production decisions. And one of the things that they were concerned about was the ability to see what happened downstream from their customers. So they started to pay attention to service level agreements and penalty clauses from the customers and pull that into the planning decision so that they minimized risk and additional payments that might need to be made. And then companies are looking to drive more efficient supply chain decisions. In achieving intelligent planning, Board enables customers to achieve extended collaboration, whether that's with your suppliers or with your customers, or maybe even your logistics partners as you outsource warehousing and logistics capability. That extended collaboration means that we need to enlarge our peripheral vision. For anybody who needs to wear glasses like me, just having a bigger set of glasses. I increased the size of my glasses significantly just a few months ago, and it's caused me to react in a different way. I don't suddenly get people surprising me out of left field or right field. The same kind of thing happens with supply chain. If you can just enlarge your vision and start to pull data into your decision-making processes, I'm not talking about integrating the data at this stage, but just pulling it into a dashboard that means that you know about a large order that's come from a customer. You can see that on the dashboard. You can see the EPOS data coming through from your customers that enables you to be aware of the kind of decisions and the context you're making those decisions in. Of course, you can integrate that data in later, but the first thing is to give visibility to that extended collaborative capability. The ability to automate the decisions you're making. Why are we spending so much time on things that cause us so little problem? If we take the Pareto thinking of 80-20, then why are we spending time on the 20% that's causing us little problems? That's why we need things like buffer stock, like Kanban systems and other things to make sure that we don't run out of the nuts and bolts of business. And then extending that expanded visibility to consider both your customers and your suppliers to make better decisions in a better and more efficient time. Intelligent planning helps us to reshape our business and to think differently. One of our customers in North America, Starkist, who's one of the largest consumers of tuna fish around the world, Ted Wong, who I did a presentation with not that long ago, said to me, Dave, part of the question I was asked by one of my team was, how do I validate the data? And he said, I don't need to, because it's already right. And that's enabled them to make fresh decisions in new ways and make those decisions, and so describe their way on the journey. So we can then use that intelligence both looking downstream in terms of distribution intelligence in the finished goods, but also looking upstream, beyond manufacturing into procurement, to think about procurement capacity. One key question I'd love to ask you all in the room is, who owns the value of the inventory in your business? I'm not expecting you to shout out the answer, but just think about it. Because in many consequences, and when I say inventory, I'm not just talking about finished goods. Finished goods is just part of the process. Finished goods, work in progress, raw materials, all of that is something that you have on your, for those financial people in the room, you have on your balance sheet. as an asset, and it's worth something. And it goes up in value as it moves through the supply chain. But it's also a liability and a risk. And if we don't pay attention to that conflict, to that challenge, then we were missing an opportunity. And so who owns the value of your inventory? It's probably as a consequence of a set of other things like customer service level agreements, batch sizes, procurement decisions. And so giving visibility both upstream and downstream in the intelligent thinking enables to look at discontinuities. You want to increase flow through the supply chain. Because if you can get that flow, just like a river, running smoothly, it runs more effectively. As soon as you put buffers, barriers, and other things in the way, then you start to get ineffectiveness. And that's the kind of capability that's driven from supply chain planning, intelligent supply chain planning. And we can go from the traditional localized suboptimal plans where things are focused in silos. And we've driven towards more profitable, achievable plans. I'd love to ask you the question in your integrated business planning, in your supply chain planning, when you get to the end of your planning process, you press the button and said, we're all agreed, that's our plan for the next 18, 24 months. I want to ask you two key questions. Number one, is it feasible? Can you actually do it? Have you got the capacity? Have you got the materials? Number two, is it profitable? And in my experience in talking to many companies like yourselves, you can typically answer one of those questions, but unusually not necessarily both. Because if you've planned it in finance, you haven't thought about capacity, typically. And if you planned it in supply chain, then you haven't thought about profitability. But actually, both of them are important at the moment. We're getting an increased level of granularity and data. Nelson talked about IoT and that level of data. Is that going to affect planning? Yes, it's going to give us much greater granularity of data. And that's going to give us the ability to make more holistic decisions. Demand planning. We heard already a couple of times today about demand planning happening in silos. Why is it that companies can promote a product at the same time there's a factory shutdown? You might say it never happens, or maybe you're now smiling wryly at me thinking, yes, Dave, I know exactly the pain of that experience. But we've got to spend our time from supply chain point of view, not looking backwards and analysing our plans. So we need to reflect upon that, how we might improve things, but to look forward. None of us would drive our car looking in the rearview mirror, not all the time. We're looking forward, and we need to be looking forward at our plans and our forecasts, not just analysing how good our historical plans were. And finally, the ability to look at scenarios. As I played with you a little this morning and showed you a quick capability into scenarios, and as we heard in the retail session there, that ability to create multiple scenarios, to be able to compare them, develop them, analyze them, put them into a library, pull them out again, to be able to learn from history. And this is one of the key things because we need a corporate memory too. People get promoted, people change, people move on. And if we don't have that place where we can store that data, then we are losing some of the corporate value that comes from scenario planning and that kind of capability. So for some people in the room, as I kind of move from supply chain to talk a little bit more about integrated business planning, it's a term you probably know, but as an academic, I want to give you a definition. I'm not going to read it out to you, but integrated planning is very much about extending capability beyond just within your business, down to your customers, up to your suppliers, considering the capability and capacity in a seamless planning manager. And whether you talk to someone like Gartner, or you talk to the guys from Oliver Wight, you will find there is a maturity model that starts with localized planning happening in Excel spreadsheets. And those Excel spreadsheets are not integrated. That one view of the business, that one overview of what's going on is where we've got to move from being disconnected to move to a foundation process. And that foundation process will drive towards capability that allows integration, and that integration will then allow capability to reshape the business and consider different approaches, where you're going to move factories to, how you're going to supply your customers in different ways, whether you want to start to move certain products on a make-to-order rather than a make-to-stock basis, to allow orchestration to then come through and to drive business thinking as we move that forward. So I'm going to hand over to Les Brookes now, who's a partner from Oliver Wight, who's going to take us into the excellence of that planning. Les.
Right, thanks, David. So I'm going to put it to you that you are part of the problem and you can be part of the solution, right? Because actually, whilst David's talked about volatility coming from external around supply chain, fundamentally, the way that we run the business causes greater stress on the supply chain outcome than just the variability externally. So I'm going to put it to you that integrated business planning is a way to run the business, right? It isn't a supply chain process. It's a way to run the business. Now, why do I believe that we are all part of the problem? Let me start with something like traditional budgeting. Who does that, right? Once a year, right? We pull together all the numbers, marketing go on this deep dive, right? What's a deep dive? It sounds like we're going way down there looking at... So they do that once a year. It's out of date the minute they do it, right? We then go through a series of negotiations about what's the demand really. Does it equal my top-down number? No. Oh, well, if it doesn't equal my top-down number, could you make it equal the top-down number? Oh, yeah, but that's the number you first thought of. So don't go with that number, go with this one. Because actually, if I go with this one, and then this might be the outcome, we might all be happy. And by the way, I've kept a little bit in reserve, because if I told you, you would be harvesting my reserve, and before I knew it, my target would be higher. Now, that's a logical behaviour, isn't it? Right? Because actually, behaviour is driven by your reward system and the way you're measured. If you're the CEO, your reward system is shareholders, right? And don't tell them too much. They don't like surprises, right? But if you're below that, your reward system is typically how you pay salespeople, percentage of bonus, et cetera, et cetera. So tell me that your salespeople that are creating that future visibility of demand alongside their marketing colleagues, who, by the way, are often invisible when it comes to what's the benefit of spending on marketing, right? In terms of state that, in terms of the volume change in a demand plan, these people disappear, right? But fundamentally, the challenge is one set of numbers to run the business. I was looking at somebody's plans, large multinational, last week, and actually there was a set of plans called demand, and the volume seemed quite high. And actually, interestingly, if I'd got AI to look at the volume versus then the financial plan, AI would have told me, hold on, this plan, when I financialise this plan, comes to greater than this financial plan that we're running the business on. How can that be? Well, of course, the reason it can be is if I don't put the volume in this plan, and then this extra that I've had in my back pocket gets delivered, supply chain won't be able to achieve it. However, if I put it in the financial plan, then my boss and the business will expect me to deliver it. So that's what I'm going to do. Now tell me how AI is going to solve that behaviour. Now, what it actually says fundamentally is if I want to create value here with my portfolio and my demand generation, and then I want to lose the least money possible, right? There are heroes in business, they're called sales and marketing, right? And there are zeros in business, they're called supply chain. If you don't want too many thanks, work in supply chain, right? And then there are the people that work the numbers, finance. There's lots of you in this audience, because what you've got to do is make the best view of all of this and come up with your set of numbers. Tell me that that's a sensible way to run a business, right? I don't think it's contemporary, I think it's very traditional. And it doesn't make sense. So, what I'm going to talk about is a thing called integrated business planning. It works on the concept that the minute you set a plan, it's out of date. Right? I always say to people, planning is easy, replanning is difficult. Look at organisations that seem to spend a lot of time managing events. So, today we're doing portfolio rationalisation. It's got too complex. Oh, so did that just happen? Was it, did it catch us by surprise? Oh, today I don't have the capacity because 2 years ago I should have taken a decision to invest in new capex. Oh, but we didn't. Now I don't have capacity, right? The issue for me is about visibility because planning starts out there. I guarantee everybody has a strategy. right? And you probably review it a couple of times a year. However, strategy is meant to give direction to a business and set the expectation. If in this year I'm already working on closing the gap in business for next year, then I should be able to remove many of the events that happen in the short term. In fact, I can tell if a business is good at integrated business planning by the number of events they need to manage in the short term. Because if you've got a high quality radar, think about the airfields, right? Air traffic control. Their radar's pretty good, isn't it, out there? And if something changes course, I guarantee when they pulse the radar the next time, they know, and they're already taking action to move this plane up to this height, move this one to here, change the approach. However, when it gets down to the short term, we better all hope, and we know, they've got a different process to manage the very short-term execution of planes landing and taking off to the radar that looks out there. So if they get them coming in the right direction at the right time, and they're avoiding issues because they've got good radar, then actually they won't have short-term events. So integrated business planning is about integrating the strategy and deploying the strategy. It is about dynamic change. So as and when things change across that future horizon, what's the impact on your business? What's the impact financially? What's the impact in delivering strategy? More importantly, now I've got visibility of that gap, what decisions as a leader do I need to take to eliminate that gap? So recognise that life changes and it's dynamic. Recognise that you need a future portfolio. 3 years out, probably, 36 months, shaping the future, service, offer, right? That's a dynamic thing. So recognise that whatever you're doing over in that portfolio needs to be integrated into what does it mean in terms of sales and marketing activity to achieve that change? What does it mean from a future supply chain shape to achieve that losing the least money, right? And by the way, what does that all mean from a latest financial projection over the next 3 years, right? Because actually, finance should not be creating numbers. They should be taking data from these core process owners, financialising that data using board to give us the future picture of the world, understanding what's changed since the last month, and actually being able to suggest additional activities that we could drive to close out that financial gap, along with the team. So recognise that what we then need to do is optimise our business financially and outcome by running scenarios. What ifs, right? What if we shape demand like this? What if we got additional opportunities? What if the client last week, what if the weather goes up to 28 degrees for more than 4 days? Now, I don't want to put the stock in place, but I do want a scenario that says, what would we do if that did happen and how would I execute that in the future? So it's important that we optimise the business with scenarios. But what's most important is clarity of decisions we want leadership to take. Right? We shouldn't have an IBP process that is meetings. We should have a by exception way of running the business. If I as a leader say anything financially plus or minus X of the revenue plan or margin, I need to be involved in making a decision to close that gap, then it sets empowerment to everybody else. And if I'm going to go outside of those parameters, I know what the impact's going to be. I know that leadership need to be involved in the decision. I put the decision in front of them. With advanced AI, etc., I can take decision quality beyond the human eye. Right? Because the human eye can't see some of the things that we've been seeing this morning around what we can do. So I can improve the quality of decision making by using those things and enhance this model. So that is integrated business planning, right? Ownership by the business. It is transformational. It is contemporary versus traditional negotiations. And by the way, change involves all of us. So I was with the CEO 2 weeks ago, 12 billion turnover company, and he said to me, this is after they've already decided to do this, he said, Les, but what I hadn't understood is this is a complete new business model. It's transformational. The project that we were employed to do is meant to be transformational, but he only understood that once he started to understand all of the behavioural impacts of achieving one set of numbers to run the business. Okay, so it is different. Now, I thought I'd put a bit more finance slant on this because I know there's a lot of finance people here. Some fundamentals, one set of numbers to run the business. One of the challenges I would have to David's earlier would be you go away and work out how many different sets of numbers people are using and second guessing in your business today. And second guessing is not the optimal outcome. Right, because I have a plan that says, actually, I better order a bit more of this material because I don't believe sales. Finance have a plan that says, actually, I don't believe either of them, so I'm going to go with this number. Before we know it, we have multiple sets of numbers around the business. That is a challenge, right? And that is induced by us and the way we manage. So, one set of numbers, rolling process, typically 36 months, change the granularity over time. It's an aggregate planning process, it shouldn't be detailed. Capture the intelligence of the business, review that intelligence to understand gaps as we move through time, okay? Continuous review, by exception, right? Don't waste your time looking for things that aren't an exception because it becomes too onerous. It's a labour activity, right? There's zero benefit. Get informed about exceptions, make sure that the process are good enough to actually deliver them, and then make sure that there is an acceptance of change and the need to align behaviour. Right? Once we've done that, then the outcome of that is bottom up, top down. What that actually means is top down, I've got business plan, strategy, budget, okay? By the way, budget should become a significant non-event, right? I bet you there's people in this room that think, Christ, Les, we start in June. Sometimes we're lucky because we might have finished by January, right? Significant non-event. Why wouldn't you, if you've had 36 months visibility of the future, why wouldn't you use that plan to cut most of the input to the budget? If it's a plan that you all believed in and was delivering one set of numbers, why wouldn't you do that? If you want a stretch, set the stretch for year 2 and year 3, give people the opportunity to work out what to do, close the gaps now. Don't wait until July, August, September to surprise everybody by saying, oh, we've now got a new stretch for next year, right? Because now we don't have the time to deal with it, right? That seems self-inflicting to me. So, bottom up versus top down, gaps are visible. That's an interesting behaviour, isn't it? Gaps are visible. That means that we have got to start to get people to tell us the truth. Now, I'm not suggesting people go to work to tell lies, because they don't, typically, but we've encouraged them not to necessarily show us the gaps across the future, right? Because typically we don't want bad news, right? How stupid is that? The sooner I understand the bad news, the more opportunity I've got something to do about it, right? When it gets into the short term, I can just do crazy things. Oh, I can cut the marketing spend, because obviously I didn't know why we had marketing in the first place, so I can cut that spend. I can stop you guys flying around the world because I don't need to do that anymore, etc., etc. But I run out of things that I can do if I leave it too short term. So, I need to make sure we've got process, visibility, escalation, right people involved in decision making, re-optimizing all the time in pursuit of excellence, and then align it across my undoubtedly complex business matrix that I've got today. Right? So that is integrated business planning. And so don't just look at supply chain and say they've got a difficult job to do. They have got a difficult job because of what David explained from the external environment. But the same impact is happening with commercial. You know, how many organisations did I tell don't believe the demand backlog you've got, especially, I know there's people from America in the room, but that term backlog, right? The orders that we should have satisfied but we haven't, on an assumption that they're not going to go away, right? How much has gone away in the last 6 months? We'll reach a divergence where supply chain lead times come down again because demand has softened, and then we'll probably get back to where we were pre-COVID, right? But a lot of it just doesn't exist. So we don't plan on that. So my message is we all have a role to play in this, and it's a different way to run the business if you want optimum success. Within board, we can capture this and we can run this process by exception. So we'll move it on, and you know, complexity is what you make of it, right? Obviously within board, we can reduce the complexity. In terms of people in this process, it's the process to run the business for all of us. Business conversations are financially driven. Budget behaviour destroys value, right? Financialised scenarios require forecasting architecture, one set of numbers. In terms of process, strategic modelling, top-down, great. You know, the module exists in board to do this. Dynamic financialisation, wow, of course it does, right? It's there, we can do this. Business gaps visible, updated plans with clarity of thinking, driven by AI-informed assumption planning. The problem with assumptions is they're more about gut feel unless you can measure them. With the advent of AI, absolutely, we can measure and we can predict the difference, okay? So even there, you know, we can move it into a more process and analytical.
Thanks, Les. So we're exploring people, process, capability. And part of the things we wanted to focus upon was driving executive behavior and enabling executive thinking from a bottom-up, top-down integrated piece. Les very carefully talked about gap management. Okay, if you are going to use your baseline planning, your IBP, to drive your budget, you've still got to manage that gap. And board does a very nice job of managing that gap where we've got a concept of a volume and a value in the future, but we don't know exactly where that is. We're not having to create phantom SKUs and do that kind of capability to build a bottom-up future. We're able to manage that and then execute into that as we drive forward. Part of the things is to help to drive different behaviours. One of the reasons why IBP fails is, number one, it's not a project. It's a culture, and it's a culture of continuous change. Les very nicely talked about how you need to be driven by exception. Well, you start with the biggest exceptions. Once you've dealt with those, you've automated those, then you lower the threshold, and then you deal with the next set of... And so actually you have a process of continuous improvement, and that continuous improvement means that your forecast accuracy hopefully will go up, your planning will be more stable, you'll be able to start to set better and better processes. One of the great things about IBP is the ability to think about, okay, where do we want to be in 6 months, 9 months, 12 months' time? How are we going to improve those planning processes to help to drive that, both from a process, people and behaviours point of view, and a technology. This is where it all comes together with great power and capability. And it's about driving transformation through business optimization. Let me give you the case study from our customer in Australia. Lamb Weston, probably most of you haven't heard of, but you've probably eaten some of their products. They are the number 1 or number 2 in Australia and North America in terms of potatoes. And you might think, well, why are potatoes difficult? Why is that a challenge? If you've eaten in McDonald's, you for sure have eaten some of their products. But they've got hundreds of thousands of acres under potatoes. And we are changing our potato eating habits. I don't know whether you've realised that. But, you know, we're eating less fries and we're wanting more wedges. And we like sweet potatoes more than we like the traditional potato. And each potato, I'm not a potato expert, by the way, even though my name is food, but there you go. But the point is, our choices change. And so consequently, they're putting potatoes in the ground. They're planning years ahead in terms of the kind of potatoes they're going to have available. And then they've also got to think about yield and seasonality and even a little bit of climate effect as well, because the potato yield is not always going to be the same in every part of the world. It's going to change over time. And with different types of potatoes, that's going to be different depending on whether it's over wet or over hot. And we can always have an excuse why it doesn't work. But Lamb Weston has helped to deliver, and they helped to deliver the IBP process from end to end, looking right ahead, 2-3 years ahead in terms of planting and preparing. And so what Lamb Weston were doing in terms of their challenge and their thinking was they wanted one process. They wanted to be able to get to. Now, they had disintegrated processes. And I'm using that word very deliberately. And I'm not talking about not integrated, I'm talking about disintegrated processes. Because they were in silos, they had data in isolation, and they weren't collaborating across the different spreadsheets. So the results often didn't line up. Organizational KPIs were different in different departments, being driven, therefore driving the assumptions that were built into the spreadsheet use themselves. There was very little internal collaboration. Not because they didn't want to talk, not because they didn't meet one another, but because actually their thinking was in silos. They were thinking about getting a better forecast. They were thinking about getting more productive marketing plans. They were thinking about sourcing for the future. And they didn't have a defined planning process to handle exceptions, to handle uncertainty. And the analysis across that, particularly with inventory, probably my favorite conversation point, but I won't go there today. So their business requirements as they were looking to improve their IBP process was the ability to have a statistical forecast that was both robust, reliable, and could be challenged and tested, looking at things like promotional events, looking at the effect of those, and turning that into a financial view. And I want to go a little bit deeper here. I'm not talking about cashing up. Some companies would have a volume forecast, and then they would cash up that forecast. They would take the volume and multiply it by a value. Well, that only gives you one. If you've multiplied it by selling price, it's given you revenue. If you multiplied it by cost price, it's given you your total cost price. But it doesn't give you the ability to play that Rubik's Cube and said, what happens if we decrease the price? Will that increase the volume, and what will that do? Exactly the scenario that I showed you first thing this morning. And then thinking about capacity. They've got to look into their future and think about the capacity that's coming from the farms, the acreage under potatoes, and what kind of yield they're going to be expecting. And therefore, for example, whether they need to water more because they need a greater yield, or whether actually the rainfall is just enough to drive those kind of things. And then reconcile that plan back into the business thinking, driving what-if scenarios, not just for the planning managers, but also for the executives themselves. And so their journey was one where they reviewed the solution first of all. They put out a scope, and I'll come back to this in a moment, but they put out a scope, but they selected a solution, they implemented IBP very successfully, but there were some things that weren't in their original scope that suddenly started to pop up. So we could do this now. We could look at promotions in light of how successful they've been or how unsuccessful they've been, and build that into a library of thinking. And so they're then starting to think about future capability and give themselves visibility across the end-to-end supply chain, from the farm to the fork, to think about that kind of capability. And so the lessons that Lamb Weston learned was, number one, to remain agile. Not to have defined it all firstly, but to remain agile, to be ready to change and adapt your thinking, because you now have a steady state planning process, and you can now adapt that from a thinking point of view. To be aware of uncertainty and to be able to discuss risk from a supply chain point of view. Risk is not something we like talking about, but there will be built into every forecast in whatever department or division you work in the business. There will be some elements of risk. And actually driving to a single number process means that you agree on what those risks are. Okay, we've got a new contract that's starting in 4 months' time. We expect it to be $5 million worth of business, but at the moment it's only 50% likely to come through. Well, how is that going to be represented? Les gave us the great example of, okay, from a finance point of view, you won't put it in the forecast. From a supply chain planning point of view, you need to put it in the forecast. Otherwise, you're not going to have the potatoes that are ready. But actually, you've just got to agree, well, how is it represented in all your plans? And then Don't just think it's a finished deliverable. Don't just think it's a process that's been completed, but drive towards continual change and continuing to drive better and drive out inflexibility, drive in structural flow. So, kind of done, but the teacher in me feels I just want to give you a few takeaways. So I hope that's okay with you. I've seen people typing things into their phone, so that's pretty good. But I'm not expecting you to do all of these, but if you just do one or two of these, and these will draw not just from mine and Leslie's presentation, but from all the presentations today. Number one, how flexible is your plan? You know, you will have built some flexibility into your processes already, but how flexible? When does it have to go back to exception management and the decision that's been taken by the IBP team now needs to be passed up to the executive to make some kind of overtime decision, investment decision, or whatever? What kind of supply chain capabilities are you truly leveraging? You know, it's often characterized by, oh, the supply chain haven't delivered, because the forecast that we had and the production plan that we had don't line up. But let me turn it the other way around. What production capacity do you have in your supply chain, in your factories, in your suppliers, that you could leverage by going to market with some different thinking? Martin Christopher, who's an emeritus professor from Cranfield, said, in the 21st century, companies will not compete on prices and products. They'll compete on supply chains and services. I don't know whether that's true for your business, but I find that a very compelling discussion. And so then I want to ask you a couple of other questions as I close. Number one, what improvements can you make? Don't think you've got there, you've finished, you've done. It's a place of continuous improvement, driving out waste and improving flexibility and capability. And always thinking, what alternatives do I have? Because with those alternatives will drive different behavior, different decisions. And therefore we can challenge the assumptions we're making to drive very effective integrated business planning, because we use the intelligence we have to drive the business that we want to have for the future. Thank you very much.